Hello and welcome to our weekly look inside Syria. I'm Hazem Seeker. It's been 2 years since the start of the Syrian conflict, and what began with peaceful demonstrations in the streets of Deraa has morphed into a nationwide conflict with sectarian, ethnic and regional overtones. In that time, tens of thousands of Syrians have been killed and more than 1 million have been forced to leave their homes. A regime that has run Syria for decades is fighting for its survival and in no mood to compromise. On the rebel side, a group of disparate forces are united by the common goal of defeating the rule of Bashar al-Assad. An uprising that was inspired by the Arab Spring is now its most violent conflict, threatening to destabilize an already turbulent Middle East. It's a situation with no end in sight, and its impact is likely to last for generations. Well, in a moment, we'll talk about the impact this war has had and the prospects for its end. First, this report from Zaina Khodr in Aleppo, where violence has become a part of daily life.
On a good day, this road is a lifeline for many people of Aleppo city, but some days it can just as easily get a person killed. The sound of sniper fire on this front line is almost continuous. Moments later, we see a minivan arrive from government-controlled territory. A woman has been shot in the neck by a sniper. Government snipers are positioned on higher ground in Masharqa district. It is a dangerous journey. The rebels control the east of the city of Aleppo, but beyond this point, it's government-controlled territory. People come under sniper fire, and some never come back. Nevertheless, people do cross back and forth in this city divided by front lines. Many of those who do are too scared to identify themselves. It is a question of survival in more ways than one.
Snipers are deliberately targeting civilians when we cross. At government checkpoints, they can arrest me for no reason.
We had to travel to the other side to get bread. In opposition district, there are no jobs. Please find us a solution.
But there is no sign that this war is ending anytime soon. Frustration is growing, particularly among the civilians.
Poor, hungry, everything. The war is not good. Nobody likes the war. Nobody.
People are tired. This woman tells us she is sick and has no other choice but to find treatment outside rebel-controlled districts.
Civilians are the victims, and they are paying the price. The government wants to affect public support for the opposition.
It is not clear why this woman refused to see the danger ahead, but it is clear that this is a country and a society torn by war. Zaina Khodr for Inside Syria, Aleppo.
Well, to assess the current situation, the possible outcomes and next steps, we're joined by our three guests in Catania, Italy. Yasser Tabbara, the legal advisor for the Syrian National Council and the Syrian Opposition Coalition in the United States. In Oklahoma, Joshua Landis, Syria expert and director of the Center for Middle East Studies and associate professor at the University of Oklahoma. And in London, we have Danny Mackey, the co-founder of the Syrian Youth in Britain, a group of Syrians advocating democratic change through dialogue. Good to have you all with us, gentlemen. Joshua Landis, if I could start with you. What does the future of Syria look like 2 years on?
Well, we're 2 years into this. It's stalemate. Refugees are flowing out at a very high number, about 250,000 this last month. There's 1 million outside already. We're going to see tons more refugees. Damascus could very well look like Aleppo in a year's time, largely destroyed with whole neighborhoods completely flattened. Assad is not giving up.
Yes, so Tabara, is that how you see things? Where do you see the conflict heading?
Well, I think that in order for us to answer that question, we need to not lose sight of the fact that this was a populist uprising to uproot a dictatorial regime that was faced with the utmost brutality. And Bashar al-Assad seems like, as your previous guest says, is not giving up. However, we're not giving up either on our right to transform Syria into a democratic civil state. The situation, we're optimistic about where we're heading. I think that the balance of power on the ground is shifting, and I think Bashar al-Assad will get that message, and hopefully that will lead into a better transformation than the very bleak picture that your guest gave.
Danny Mackey, I know you head up a group that advocates reform in Syria through dialogue, but those on the rebel side say that that was tried many months ago, and the Assad regime simply doesn't understand that. The only thing they understand is violence, and that's why this conflict has taken the turn it has.
I think when you discuss the Syria crisis now, there is, in terms of violence, there is a balanced playing field. The violence which is being perpetrated by the opposition groups and the rebels is almost on the same scale. There is an element of strategic parity on the ground. I would just like to say that Damascus is not going to turn into Aleppo. I was in Damascus a few weeks ago, and Damascus is actually relatively safe, internally speaking. There is conflict on the outskirts, but central Damascus is relatively safe. There is a big difference between wanting democracy and wanting democratic change, and between funding an uprising which is armed and which is funded by regional Arab countries. So the biggest problem here is who supports a political solution. In order to really look towards the future and have hope in a democratic transformation internally in terms of Syria, we need to really pursue a policy which is based on a political solution with dialogue between the different sides. And in all honesty, the opposition reject dialogue and have rejected dialogue since the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring in Syria, which has fueled bloodshed, violence and internal instability, which is very rare for Syria internally.
Well, Danny Mackey, no one will argue with you that this has now become an armed uprising, but that's not how it started back in March of 2011. All of the counts that we got, all of the videos that we saw, was that this was a peaceful uprising, peaceful demonstrations in a number of cities in Syria, and the way the regime responded was with brute force, and that's why we have the conflict that we have now.
In all honesty, it did begin as peaceful pro-democracy as an uprising for peace, for democracy, for an element of political change inside of Syria. But however, this has been hijacked by the Muslim Brotherhood, and this is very clear since the presence of al-Qaeda and radical jihadist groups within the armed opposition within Syria. The issue of moderate rebels is also very dangerous, discussing the concept of having a liberal element within the opposition, as America has a two-pronged strategy within the Syria crisis of blacklisting the dangerous Islamic movements such as Jabhat al-Nusra, an al-Qaeda affiliated group, and at the same time funding and arming the democratic rebels. But to an extent, at this current moment in time, it remains to be seen whether there are any big democratically supported rebel movements within Syria. The majority of them are extremist. The majority of them do belong to an Islamist ideology, which presents an issue of fear and threatens Syria's future of having this clash of ideologies between a moderate Syria and an extremist Syria. The uprising in Syria did begin in terms of peaceful pro-democracy uprisings. But at the moment, it has turned into a brutal proxy war, which is being funded by different regional powers and international powers, and it threatens the security of the region and the security of Europe with the presence of these radical jihadist groups. It is an armed conflict, and it is not a revolution in the sense that we had in Libya or Tunisia or any of the other countries, although in Libya there was intervention. So we have to ultimately argue that Syria is now in front of either a military solution, which is impossible as there is stalemate on the ground, or a political solution, which really does take both sides on a negotiating table and finds a legitimate solution to this ongoing crisis.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, Tabara, you were shaking your head there earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where to start. I mean, there's a number of contradictions in the statements that have been made, a number of factual inaccuracies, chief of which is the fact that the opposition has refused to dialogue. We have attempted the dialogue over and over and over again. The last attempt was the initiative by the president of the coalition, Sheikh Muaz Khatib, who is a voice of Muslim moderation, someone who has called for direct dialogue on several levels and several occasions. It was squarely rejected by the regime. There are a number of inaccuracies and contradictions. Your guest conflates the Muslim Brotherhood with al-Qaeda, with extremist elements. He says that the majority of the fighters on the ground are extremists. These are simple factual inaccuracies and simply not true. The fact of the matter is, over the past 2 years, there has been a great deal of consolidation of military councils, and those on the ground fighting came together under a joint command of a chief of staff under the leadership of General Salim Idris, who is a very moderate voice, someone who believes in professionalizing the army, someone who believes that the future of the Syrian army should be one that is not sectarian, should be one that belongs to a political system that answers to civilian politicians. There's a large amount of discourse and cognition across the board, politically and among the armed opposition, that should be the future of Syria. That's what it should look like. And I think.
We'll come back to the different points of view on what is happening on the ground here. But let's get a quick overview of what 2 years of war has cost the country and its people. The United Nations estimates that some 70,000 people have been killed in Syria in the last 24 months. About 3 million others are without homes, essentially refugees in their own country. And so far, at least 1 million people have escaped to safety beyond Syria's borders to neighboring countries like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. And it's thought that number could be much higher. And that brings me to the question, Joshua Landis, that comparisons have already been made between this conflict and the civil war in Lebanon, which lasted 15 years. And one certainly hopes that the same doesn't happen in Syria. But given the stalemate that is apparent here, could this conflict drag on for several years more?
Absolutely, it could. It could drag on for quite a long time. You know, most people thought it would end up like Iraq, with the majority population. In Iraq, of course, it was the Shiites, 60% of the population, overthrowing the minoritarian regime, Sunnis, and that they would come to a clean, establish a government and so forth. The big difference between Syria and Iraq is that in Iraq, you had boots on the ground. The American army not only destroyed Saddam's regime in about 3 weeks, but most importantly, they restrained all the other Shiite contenders for power, like the Sadrist movement, and they helped Maliki establish a central state. In Syria, there are no boots on the ground, and what you see is this incredible fragmentation of the opposition militias. And that leads you to the Lebanon model, which is various militias fighting each other to a standstill. Now, Syria could be different because 70% of Syrians are Sunni Arabs, and they're the ones who are making up this revolt. And the minorities are only about 20%, the minorities that are fighting here. That's the Alawites, Christians, Druze, so forth. The Kurds are standing aside. 10% of Syria are Kurds. Of course, they're Sunnis. And many of them in the east want their own country or a great deal of autonomy. And so they're in a sense, standing on the sidelines. But the minorities have an extraordinary battle in front of them. And that's why this is taking so long because the Alawites feel that they are facing a zero-sum game, that this is an existential moment, and they could be wiped out, that there could be, if the Islamic militias penetrate into the Alawite regions, you could see 2 million Alawites empty out into Lebanon in a matter of days. So we've seen this kind of big movement of people before in Palestine and in Turkey.
Well, based on your assessment then, Joshua, it sounds like the only thing that's going to tip the balance here is some sort of outside intervention.
Well, I think the outsiders are very worried about tipping the balance too much. If they go for a big Sunni win, which is what many people are calling for, it'll be like Iraq, where the Shiites locked up power, and now the Sunnis are on the warpath. They're all joining al-Qaeda. We see an uptick of violence because they've been pushed out of power completely. If this happens in Syria, of course, and that's the difficulty with a big foreign intervention, is that if they just decapitate Assad's regime, send cruise missiles into his palaces, which many people have advocated and could happen easily, then you would have the stampede to the other side. It could lead to ethnic cleansing, and Lebanon could be filled up with refugees and destabilized. You'd have another Palestinian issue, if you were, in the Middle East. And we know that by ethnically cleansing Palestinians from Palestine in 48 led to 67 war, 73, constant instability. And I think the Western powers are frozen, paralyzed in fear. They don't want the Sunnis to win outright too hard, so they're letting this play out, hoping to balance between the two sides. And they don't like it. They don't like Assad. They'd like to see him go, but they're frightened of the new power of the Islamists.
Danny Mackey, I know you want to respond to
increasingly, they're the
this.
ones who are winning on the ground.
Yes, I mean, it is very, very, very naive to really look at the Syria crisis only through a sectarian microscope. This is ultimately part of the media misconception that we have, that it is a sectarian uprising, that it is based on ethnic and religious fault lines. It is not a sectarian uprising. Syria is very dissimilar to what is happening in Lebanon and dissimilar to what is happening in Iraq. The closest scenario to the Syrian scenario is the Algerian scenario, where you had a long, prolonged struggle between the Islamists and the central government. It is very unfortunate to hear such experts discuss the Syria crisis through a Sunni and a Shia and an Alawite perspective. It is not necessarily a sectarian struggle. We comprehend that the biggest two cities in Syria are Aleppo and Damascus, which contain 12 million, which is almost half the population of Syria. But the majority of these inhabitants are moderate Sunnis who support the Syrian government. They make up the bourgeois kind of side in Syria, which is very strong, has very strong ties to the government, and is not necessarily involved in the conflict. You could argue that it is a struggle between the city and the kind of the countryside areas, based on a more kind of Marxist viewpoint of how this conflict has kind of taken place. But to really pursue the idea or the theorem that this is a sectarian issue is very untrue. There are many Alawites within the opposition, just as there are many Sunnis within the government. The majority of government politicians are not Alawite; they are Sunni. So it is a very common misconception of having this this lack of coherent terminology to define what is happening in Syria. Ultimately, you could argue that, in reply to Yasser, who stated that there are many misconceptions in what I said, the opposition since the first day have rejected all forms of dialogue. In all of the Friends of Syria meetings, the main issue which was discussed was the post-Assad era, after the regime, was getting rid of Assad, not through dialogue, but through military solution. The National Coalition admits to the concept that Jabhat al-Nusra and Nusra Front is the strongest military force under the auspice of the opposition on the ground in Syria. So ultimately, they adhere to the concept that the Islamist fighters are the most important.
Yes,
so
sir.
at the same time,
all right. Yes,
I would just like to say one thing.
Go ahead briefly then.
Rejecting a political solution is not necessarily in the interest of the Syrian regime at this current moment in time. This is why they have had a concept which is open towards any political dialogue. The National Coalition is essentially controlled by certain regional countries and international countries who fund them. Even if they wanted peace and dialogue, they would not be allowed to do so.
I want to get Yasser Tabara's response on some of this. And I want to ask you as well, is this a misconception that this is a sectarian conflict?
I think that the obsession of analyzing the Syrian situation through this very sectarian lens is just overstated, and I think that
all right. So we found one thing that you and Danny Mackey agree on then.
Yes, we definitely do agree on that. I mean, I think that there's nothing in the Syrian revolution when it first started up until this day that suggests that this is a revolution of Sunnis against minorities. This has been always been a revolution of a populist uprising of people against the dictatorial regime. That's been the discourse of the revolution from day one. That is the discourse of the revolution and its political leadership and even its militaristic leadership today. In terms of what Danny was saying regarding the attempts of dialogue or our position on dialogue, again, we have been very clear that we have not rejected the political solution. We have come to the realization, like most analysts and experts in the world, that Bashar al-Assad is not interested in a political solution, and that any solution, as far as he's concerned, as far as his masters in Iran are concerned, is one that keeps him in power. Keeping Bashar al-Assad in power necessarily means, and this is an argument against those who say that that's basically a militaristic resistance of Bashar al-Assad regime and his brutality and his Scud missiles and his air force are not the way to go. Keeping Bashar al-Assad in power necessarily means a return to brutality, to oppression, the jailing of hundreds of thousands of activists, the complete destruction of any semblance of a democratic movement in Syria.
Right.
We are not naive to the challenges that we're facing
on the ground. I want to move on now to a major development that we saw this week, and that is that Britain and France have announced moves to begin lifting an arms embargo in Syria, defying many of their European partners in the process, I might add. What impact will this decision have on the rebel fight, Joshua Landis?
Well, it could have an important impact if they're willing to give anti-aircraft missiles and so forth. It could be a decisive change. Now, Germany and some other countries have spoken out against this. They're worried about it. They think that might help destabilize Lebanon, worried about Israel, so forth. All of the regional countries have expressed some concern about shoveling more arms in. But it may, in fact, be the way. I mean, Europe has been very outspoken about this. The United States still is sitting on their hands and is not willing to give more arms. So Europe could go out ahead on this, and in which case they would take responsibility for future developments. And that would be very good for the United States. I think the United States has been hoping that someone else would take the lead. They looked to Turkey, they looked to Saudi Arabia, Arab League. Now, if Europe would take the lead on Syria and begin to formulate a policy, I think that would be very gratifying to the United States. But it could make a difference if they're willing to really put in real weapons. I mean, they could do it in very short manner, because we've seen the opposition starve the real weapons. Syria has the Air Force. It's got the large weapon systems, and that's what's the Syrian military, and which has allowed them to hang on the way they have been and put up such fierce resistance.
Danny Mackey, when you see this development, doesn't this tell you that all international efforts to deal with the Assad regime diplomatically have failed, and that European nations like Britain and France see no alternative than supplying arms to the rebels?
Of course, when you have a global and a regional political power struggle and a geopolitical struggle within the Middle East, what you have is two essentially entrenched sides. You have the European Union with the United States, and on the other side you have the status quo, China, Russia, so-called the BRIC states which support non-intervention in the internal affairs of other states and state sovereignty. So what we now have is Britain and France trying to bypass the European Union and take direct steps to really arm the opposition. But essentially we have to comprehend opposition has already begun, and there is states such as Sweden, Denmark, Germany, who have real reluctancy to arm these rebels inside of Syria when they comprehend that al-Qaeda is one of the groups which is in Syria, and these weapons could make it to the wrong people. This is why it comes back to the concept of moderate rebels. The Guardian reported that Britain and France are also training Syrian rebels in Jordanian territory.
That is going to have to be the
last
word. We've got to leave it there. I want to thank all three of our guests in Catania, Italy, Yasser Tabbara, in Oklahoma City, Joshua Landis, and in London, Danny Mackey. And thank you for joining us. Remember, Al Jazeera has extensive coverage of what's going on in Syria, not just on this program, but our on-the-hour news bulletins and online at aljazeera.com. I'm Hazem Seeker. Thanks for joining us. The news is up next.